The city was alive with its usual chaos, a blur of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the faint chatter of conversations drowned by the winter wind. Snowflakes floated lazily, resting briefly on Jamar's thin jacket before disappearing into nothingness. He sat hunched over on the sidewalk, clutching a tattered cardboard sign that read, "Hungry, anything helps." People passed by, their scarves pulled high and their eyes averted, as though looking at him would transfer his misfortune. His stomach growled, a painful reminder of how long it had been since his last meal. He didn't bother begging. He had learned long ago that desperation only invited mockery. From across the street, Michael stepped out of a warm coffee shop, a steaming cup in hand. He was an unassuming man in his 40s, dressed in a wool coat and scarf. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes landed on Jamar. At first, Michael hesitated, unsure what to do. He had seen countless homeless individuals in the city, and like everyone else, he had ignored most of them. But something about this boy, no older than 14, struck a chord. Maybe it was the way he sat, head bowed but shoulders stiff, as if daring the world to break him further. Michael crossed the street, the crunch of snow under his boots announcing his approach. Jamar glanced up, his dark eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Hey kid," Michael said, kneeling down. "You hungry?" Jamar nodded hesitantly but didn't speak. Michael extended his coffee cup. "Take this. It's not much, but it's warm." Jamar stared at the cup as if it were a trick. Slowly, his trembling fingers reached out and took it. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Behind them, a couple walking by muttered loudly enough to be heard, "Why bother? They don't want help. They just take advantage." Michael's jaw tightened, but he ignored them. "What's your name?" he asked. Jamar hesitated. "Jamar." "Well, Jamar, you picked a lousy night to be out here. Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Jamar shook his head quickly, pulling the cup close to his chest. "I'm fine. People don't like it when people like me go with people like you." Michael frowned, understanding the unspoken implications. "People can mind their own business," he said firmly. "You look like you're about to freeze out here. Let me help." They walked in silence for several blocks, Jamar trailing a step behind Michael as if ready to bolt. Snow crunched beneath their feet, and the glow of streetlights painted faint halos around them. Michael led Jamar to a small diner, its neon sign flickering with age. Inside, the warmth was a stark contrast to the biting cold. A waitress eyed them warily as they entered, her gaze lingering on Jamar's ragged appearance. Michael ignored her and guided Jamar to a booth in the corner. "What do you want?" Michael asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Jamar shrugged, his eyes darting to the menu but not lingering. "I don't care. Whatever's cheap." Michael signaled the waitress. 2 burgers and fries, and a couple of hot chocolates. The waitress raised an eyebrow but nodded. Jamar shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You don't have to do all this. I'm not your problem." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You're not a problem, Jamar. You're a kid who needs a break." As they waited for their food, Michael noticed the stares. A man in a business suit glanced at Jamar and shook his head disapprovingly. A woman at the counter whispered to her companion, her eyes darting toward their booth. Michael could feel the weight of their judgment, but he refused to let it bother him. Jamar, on the other hand, shrank further into his seat. "You're gonna get yourself in trouble. Hanging around me," Jamar muttered. Michael smiled faintly. "Trouble's overrated." Their food arrived, the aroma of greasy burgers filling the air. Jamar hesitated, but Michael gave him a reassuring nod. Finally, Jamar dug in, devouring the meal like someone who hadn't eaten in days. After dinner, Michael paid the bill and led Jamar back out into the cold. They walked in silence until they reached a quiet street where Michael's modest apartment building stood. "This is me," Michael said, gesturing to the building. Jamar stopped. I should go." Michael turned to face him. "Go where? Back to that sidewalk?" Jamar shifted from foot to foot, his expression conflicted. "I'll be fine. I don't want to cause you any trouble." Michael sighed. running a hand through his hair. "Listen, I've got a couch. It's not fancy, but it's better than freezing to death out here. Just one night. No strings attached." Jamar hesitated for what felt like an eternity before nodding slowly. "Okay. One night." Inside Michael's apartment, the warmth was almost overwhelming. It was small but tidy, with mismatched furniture and books stacked haphazardly on shelves. Jamar stood awkwardly near the door, unsure where to go. "You can put your stuff down over there," Michael said, pointing to the couch. Jamar didn't have much, a beat-up backpack and the clothes on his back. He set the bag down and sank onto the couch, his body visibly relaxing for the first time. "I'll grab you a blanket," Michael said, disappearing into a closet. When he returned, Jamar was already half asleep, his head resting on the arm of the couch. Michael draped the blanket over him, watching as the boy's breathing slowed. "Good night, kid," he whispered. The next morning, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the heater. Michael was in the kitchen, making eggs and toast, when Jamar stirred awake. "You're still here," Michael said, smiling. Jamar rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, thanks, I guess." They ate breakfast in silence, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates. Michael didn't push for conversation, sensing Jamar's unease. After breakfast, Michael leaned back in his chair. "So, what's your story, Jamar?" Jamar froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "I don't have one." "Everyone's got a story," Michael said gently. "You don't have to tell me, but I'm here if you ever want to." Jamar didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of trust appeared in his eyes. Later that day, as Michael prepared to head out for errands, he turned to Jamar. "You can stay here if you want. I'll be back in a couple of hours." "You're just leaving me here?" Jamar asked, surprised. Michael nodded. "I trust you." Jamar didn't know how to respond. Walking through the city, Michael couldn't stop thinking about Jamar. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to help this boy, but he couldn't ignore it. Maybe it was guilt for all the times he had walked by someone in need. Or maybe it was something deeper, a need to prove that kindness still mattered. When Michael returned, he found Jamar sitting on the couch, flipping through one of his books. "You like to read?" Michael asked. Jamar shrugged. "Sometimes." Michael smiled. "You can borrow any of those if you want, as long as you promise to stick around for a while." For the first time, Jamar smiled faintly. "We'll see." The seed of trust had been planted. The road ahead would be hard, but for now, they had taken the first step. Jamar woke up on the couch to the sound of a clattering pan. The aroma of eggs sizzling in the kitchen made his stomach rumble. He rubbed his eyes and looked around. For a moment, he had forgotten where he was, a warm room with faded curtains, an old couch, and shelves full of books. It wasn't home, but it wasn't the street either. He glanced at his backpack on the floor. He could leave now, no questions asked. But where would he go? He had been running for so long, from foster homes, shelters, and people who didn't care. This man, Michael, seemed different, but how long would that last? Michael peeked around the kitchen corner. "Morning, sleepyhead. I made breakfast." Jamar muttered a quick, "Thanks," and pulled the blanket tighter around himself. As Michael set plates on a small dining table, Jamar quietly made up his mind. He would leave before nightfall. No point in sticking around and being someone's burden. After breakfast, Michael leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. "So, Jamar, what's your plan?" Jamar blinked. "Plan? I don't really have one." "Well, how about this? We hit a few places today. See if we can find you some work." Jamar frowned. "Work? No one's gonna hire me." "Why not?" "Look at me," Jamar said, gesturing to his worn clothes. "I ain't exactly management material." Michael chuckled. "Lucky for you. Most places don't hire for management right off the bat. Let's start small. You're young, and people like giving kids a chance." Jamar didn't argue, but he didn't share Michael's optimism either. Still, he grabbed his backpack and followed Michael out the door. Michael and Jamar spent the morning visiting local businesses. They started with a bakery, where the owner politely declined after a single glance at Jamar. At a gas station, the manager barely let them explain before shaking his head. By the fourth rejection, Jamar's patience was wearing thin. "Told you," he muttered as they walked down the street. "No one wants me." Michael sighed but kept his tone steady. "It's not about you, Jamar. It's about their ignorance. That's on them, not you." Jamar snorted. "Easy for you to say." Michael stopped walking and looked Jamar in the eye. "You're right. It is easier for me. But that doesn't mean I'm giving up, and it doesn't mean you should either." Jamar shrugged and followed reluctantly. Their luck changed when they stepped into a small diner tucked between two office buildings. The place smelled of bacon grease and coffee, and the hum of conversations filled the air. Behind the counter, a middle-aged man in a grease-stained apron was flipping pancakes. Michael approached the counter. "Hi there. You the owner?" The man nodded. "Yeah. Name's Sal. What can I do for you?" Michael gestured to Jamar. "My friend here is looking for work. He's a hard worker, just needs someone to give him a chance." Sal raised an eyebrow and looked Jamar up and down. "How old are you, kid?" 14, Jamar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ever worked in a kitchen before?" "No, sir." Sal scratched his chin, then sighed. "We're short a dishwasher. Pays not much, and it's messy work. You want it?" Jamar's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, sir. I'll take it." "Good. You start tomorrow," Sal said, sliding a stack of dishes toward the sink. "Be here at 7 sharp." Jamar nodded quickly, a rare flicker of excitement lighting up his face. The next morning, Jamar stood nervously by the sink as Sal showed him how to use the industrial dishwasher. The pile of dirty plates, pans, and silverware seemed endless, and the heat from the machine made him sweat. By lunchtime, Jamar had already broken 2 plates and burned his hand on a hot pan. Sal didn't yell, but his constant corrections made Jamar feel like a failure. As the lunch rush died down, Jamar leaned against the sink, exhausted. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," he muttered. Sal shrugged. "Everyone messes up on their first day. You keep showing up, you'll get better." That evening, Michael stopped by the diner. He sat at the counter, waving at Jamar, who was scrubbing pots in the back. When Jamar came out to clear some tables, Michael smiled. "How's it going?" "Terrible," Jamar said, dropping a rag onto a table. "I broke stuff, got yelled at, and I smell like grease." Michael chuckled. "Sounds like a typical first day. But you showed up. That's the hard part." Jamar shrugged, but couldn't hide the faint smile creeping onto his face. By the end of his first week, Jamar was starting to get the hang of things. He moved faster, broke fewer dishes, and even managed to joke with one of the cooks. When Sal handed him his first paycheck, a crisp envelope with his name scrawled on the front, Jamar stared at it in disbelief. "You earned it, kid," Sal said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't spend it all in one place." Jamar smiled, a real smile this time, and tucked the envelope carefully into his pocket. Meanwhile, back in Michael's neighborhood, word had spread about Jamar. At the local coffee shop, 2 women whispered loudly enough for Michael to hear as he grabbed his morning coffee. "Can you believe he's letting that boy stay with him?" one woman said. "What kind of trouble is he bringing into our neighborhood?" the other added. Michael ignored them, but the words stung. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. When Michael got home that evening, Jamar was sitting on the couch, staring at his paycheck envelope. "What do I do with this?" Jamar asked. Michael smiled. "Whatever you want. It's yours." Jamar hesitated, then pulled the envelope open. The amount wasn't much, but it was more than he'd ever held in his hands before. "I never thought I'd earn something," he said quietly. Michael sat down beside him. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Jamar nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. To celebrate, Michael cooked spaghetti, and Jamar offered to help. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, laughing as Jamar struggled to figure out how to use a can opener. Over dinner, Jamar talked more than he ever had before. About his love of cooking shows, the food he wanted to try, and his dream of having a place of his own someday. Michael listened, letting the boy's enthusiasm fill the room. For the first time in a long time, Jamar felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Michael was out front, shoveling snow off the sidewalk, when his neighbor, Mrs. Grayson approached. She was an older woman with sharp features and a sharper tongue. She stopped, clutching her coat tight against the cold. "Morning, Michael," she said. Her tone clipped. "Morning," Michael replied, not looking up from his work. "I've been hearing some interesting things about your new house guest," she said. Michael straightened, leaning on his shovel. "What about him?" Mrs. Grayson's lips pursed. "Well, some of us are concerned. A boy like that. Well, you don't know where he's been or what kind of trouble he could bring." Michael tightened his grip on the shovel. "He's a kid, Mrs. Grayson, not trouble." "Maybe so," she said, her tone oozing condescension. "But you know how people talk. Just be careful, Michael." As she walked away, Michael shook his head, muttering under his breath, "It's not the boy I need to be careful of." That evening, as Michael arrived home from work, another neighbor, Jim, stood waiting near the entrance to the building. Jim was a large man, the kind who always had something to say but rarely anything kind. "Mike, we need to talk," Jim began, blocking the door. Michael sighed. "What is it, Jim?" Jim folded his arms. "Look, everyone's talking about that boy you brought in. A lot of us don't feel safe knowing he's around." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You don't feel safe? He's 14. Doesn't matter. I've seen his kind before, trouble waiting to happen." Michael's jaw clenched. "He's just a kid trying to get by. If you've got a problem with that, it's your problem, not mine." Jim stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're gonna regret this, Mike. Mark my words." Michael pushed past him and went inside, slamming the door behind him. The next day, Michael met his friend Paul at their usual diner. Paul was one of Michael's oldest friends, someone who often played devil's advocate. "Mike, I heard about the kid," Paul began after their coffee arrived. "What about him?" Michael asked, his tone defensive. "People are talking. Look, I get that you're trying to help, but are you sure about this? You're putting a lot on the line." Michael leaned back in his chair. "Like what?" "Your reputation, for one. People don't like seeing you taking someone who doesn't belong." Michael's eyes narrowed. "And what does that mean, Paul?" Paul sighed. "It means you're fighting an uphill battle. I'm just saying, be careful." Michael shook his head. "Careful isn't going to help that boy. He needs someone to believe in him." Paul didn't argue further, but his worried expression lingered as they parted ways. That evening, as Michael checked his mail, a plain white envelope slipped out of the stack. Inside was a note scrawled in messy handwriting. "Get rid of the boy or else." Michael's stomach twisted. He looked around the empty hallway, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. He folded the note and tucked it into his pocket, deciding not to show Jamar. At least, not yet. Later that night, Michael was in the kitchen making tea when Jamar walked in. The boy hesitated in the doorway, holding the folded note. "What's this?" Jamar asked quietly. Michael froze. "Where did you find that?" "It was in the trash," Jamar said, his voice trembling. "Is this about me?" Michael sighed and leaned against the counter. "Yeah, but don't worry about it. It's just talk." Jamar shook his head. "It's not just talk. They mean it. I should go." "No," Michael said firmly. "You're not running. That's what they want." Jamar looked down at the note, his shoulders slumping. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "Because someone has to," Michael said. "And because I see more in you than you see in yourself." The next morning, Michael woke up to find Jamar packing his backpack. "Where do you think you're going?" Michael asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Back to the streets," Jamar muttered. "It's better for both of us." Michael stepped into the room, blocking the door. "No, it's not. You think leaving will make this easier? It won't. For either of us." Jamar looked away. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Michael crouched down, so they were eye level. "Jamar, the world's already full of people who give up when things get hard. I'm not one of them, and I don't want you to be either." After a long pause, Jamar dropped his bag and sat back down. At the diner, things were no better. Customers began grumbling about Jamar being in the back. One man, a regular, made his opinion known loudly. "Can't believe you're letting someone like him touch the dishes," the man sneered to Sal. Sal didn't flinch. The kid works hard. That's what matters. The man shook his head. You're gonna lose business over this, Sal. Then so be it, Sal said, turning back to the grill. In the kitchen, Jamar overheard the exchange and felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. Later, as Jamar cleaned up after closing, Sal patted him on the back. You're doing good work, kid. Don't let people like that get to you. Jamar nodded, but his doubts lingered. That night, Michael and Jamar returned home to find the front door vandalized. Someone had spray-painted the words, "Get out," in bold red letters across the wood. Michael stared at the door, his fists clenched. Jamar stood silently beside him, his expression unreadable. Go inside, Michael said quietly. What about the door? Jamar asked. I'll deal with it tomorrow. As they sat in the living room, the tension between them was palpable. Michael stared at the floor, his mind racing, while Jamar fiddled with the strap of his backpack. Finally, Jamar spoke. Why do you keep fighting for me? Michael looked up, his expression softening. Because someone fought for me once. When I was your age, I was angry, lost, and didn't think I mattered. But someone saw me, and they didn't give up. I'm just passing that on. Jamar nodded slowly, his defenses breaking down. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. The morning after the vandalism, Michael and Jamar woke up to an unexpected sight. Their front door was freshly painted. A note hung from the knob. No one should have to deal with that. Keep fighting. It wasn't signed, but the small act of kindness warmed Michael's heart. See? Michael said, turning to Jamar. Not everyone's against us. Jamar looked skeptical but didn't say anything. Deep down, he wondered if it was possible for people to change. Later that day, Michael returned home with a surprise. A bag of clothes and supplies. A woman from the church dropped these off, Michael explained, setting the bag on the couch. She said she heard about what happened and wanted to help. Jamar hesitated before reaching into the bag. Inside were warm sweaters, clean jeans, and even a new pair of sneakers. He picked up the sneakers, running his fingers over the laces. Why would she do this? She doesn't even know me, Jamar asked. Because some people care without needing a reason, Michael replied. You just have to let them. At the diner, Jamar was starting to find his rhythm. He worked faster, breaking fewer plates and earning quiet nods of approval from Sal. One day, Sal showed him how to chop vegetables properly. You want to be a chef someday, right? Sal asked. Jamar looked up in surprise. How do you know that? Michael mentioned it, Sal said with a grin. Figured I'd teach you the basics. Jamar's chest swelled with pride as he practiced chopping onions, ignoring the sting of tears in his eyes. One afternoon, a diner regular, an older woman named Mrs. Lopez, waved Jamar over. You're new here, huh? She asked. Yes, ma'am, Jamar replied nervously. Well, you're doing a fine job. Keep it up, she said, slipping him $1 as a tip. Jamar blinked in surprise. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Lopez smiled warmly. Just call me Maria. And don't let anyone tell you you're not good enough. For the first time, Jamar felt a flicker of belonging. On Jamar's first day off in weeks, Michael surprised him with a trip to the park. It's not much, Michael said as they sat on a bench, watching families play in the snow. But I figured you could use a break. Jamar watched a group of kids building a snowman and smiled faintly. I never did stuff like this when I was little. Well, no time like the present, Michael said, tossing him a snowball. Jamar laughed as he ducked, then grabbed a handful of snow and retaliated. For a brief moment, he felt like a kid again. That evening, as they warmed up with hot chocolate, Jamar grew thoughtful. Sal's been teaching me some stuff in the kitchen, he said. It's kind of fun. I think maybe I want to be a chef. Michael beamed. That's a great goal, Jamar. You've got the work ethic for it. Jamar looked down at his mug. You think I can do it? Michael's voice was firm. I don't think you can. One step at a time. A week later, Michael received a call from Pastor Jenkins, the head of the local church. I've been hearing about you and Jamar, the pastor said. I wanted you to know that you're not alone. If you ever need support, we're here. Michael felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Pastor. That means a lot." The pastor chuckled. "You're doing good work, Michael. Keep it up." Sal called Michael one evening. "Got some news for you," he said. "I was talking to a buddy of mine who runs another diner across town. He's looking for part-time help and is willing to give Jamar a shot." Michael smiled. "That's amazing, Sal. I'll let him know." When Michael shared the news, Jamar's face lit up. "You mean someone else wants to hire me? They don't just want you, Jamar. They need you." As Jamar's confidence grew, so did the tension in the neighborhood. Some residents started warming up, offering nods of encouragement or even small smiles. Others, however, grew louder in their opposition. One evening, Michael overheard a heated argument between two neighbors. "Why are you defending them?" one man spat. "Because it's the right thing to do," the other replied firmly. Michael couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Change was slow, but it was happening. That night, Jamar insisted on cooking dinner. He whipped up a simple pasta dish, and while it wasn't perfect, Michael praised it as if it were a 5-star meal. "You're just saying that," Jamar said, grinning. "No, I mean it," Michael replied. "This is the best meal I've had in ages." As they sat together, eating and laughing, Jamar felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. For the first time, he began to believe that his life could truly change. The morning began like any other, with Michael and Jamar sitting at the small kitchen table, sharing toast and coffee. As Jamar reached for the peanut butter, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Grayson. "You might want to check your car." Frowning, Michael pulled on his coat and stepped outside. His breath clouded in the cold air as he approached his car. Spray-painted across the driver's side door were the words, "Traitor." Jamar appeared at the doorway, his face pale. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Michael turned, forcing a smile. "Nothing we can't handle." But as he looked at Jamar's worried expression, he realized just how serious things were becoming. Determined to put an end to the harassment, Michael went to the police station later that day. He explained the vandalism and handed over the threatening note from earlier. The officer on duty, a tired-looking man in his 40s, barely glanced at the papers. "We'll make a report," the officer said flatly, "but these things rarely lead to anything. Could just be kids messing around." Michael's temper flared. "Kids don't write notes like this. This is serious." The officer shrugged. "We'll keep an eye out." As Michael left the station, he felt a surge of frustration. He was on his own. That evening, Jamar sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The spray paint incident had shaken him deeply. "This is my fault," Jamar said suddenly. Michael looked up from his book. "What is?" "All of it," Jamar replied, his voice breaking. "The threats, the door, your car. If I wasn't here, none of this would have happened." Michael set the book down and crossed the room, kneeling in front of Jamar. "Listen to me. This is not your fault. People like that, they don't need a reason to hate. You being here just gave them something to focus on." Jamar shook his head. "I don't want to make things worse for you." "You're not," Michael said firmly. "You're making them better. And that's what scares them." Word of the vandalism spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents expressed sympathy, while others saw it as vindication. At the grocery store, Michael overheard two women whispering in the next aisle. "It's his own fault," one said. "Bringing that boy into our neighborhood was bound to stir up trouble." "Well, at least someone's sending a message," the other replied. Michael clenched his fists but said nothing. The battle wasn't just against vandals. It was against years of ingrained prejudice. The next day at the diner, Jamar worked quietly, his usual energy dulled. During a lull in the lunch rush, Sal called him over. "Kid, you've been dragging your feet all day. What's going on?" Jamar hesitated, then told Sal about the threats and vandalism. Sal frowned but didn't interrupt. When Jamar finished, Sal leaned forward. "Let me tell you something, kid. People like that, they only win if you let them scare you. You keep showing up, you keep working hard, that's how you beat them." Jamar nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess." "No guessing," Sal said. "Just do it." That evening, Michael was confronted again. this time by a group of neighbors who had gathered outside his building. "Mike, we've been patient," Jim said, stepping forward as their unofficial spokesperson. "But enough is enough. That boy's gotta go." Michael folded his arms. "He's not going anywhere." Jim's face darkened. "You're putting the whole neighborhood at risk. People don't like him being here." "Maybe the problem isn't him," Michael shot back. "Maybe it's all of you." The crowd murmured angrily, but Michael stood his ground. Finally, Jim threw up his hands. "Fine, but don't say we didn't warn you." Late that night, Jamar woke to the sound of breaking glass. He bolted upright, his heart pounding, and ran to Michael's room. "Michael," he whispered urgently, "something's outside." Michael grabbed a flashlight and headed to the living room. One of the windows was shattered, shards of glass glinting on the floor. A brick lay in the middle of the room, wrapped in another threatening note. "Last warning." Michael sighed deeply. "It's just a scare tactic," he said, though his hands were shaking. Jamar stared at the brick, fear etched on his face. "What if they do more next time?" "They won't," Michael said, though he wasn't entirely sure. The next day, Pastor Jenkins knocked on Michael's door. The older man's warm smile was a welcome relief after the previous night's events. "I heard about what happened," the pastor said, stepping inside. "I wanted to check on you and Jamar." "We're managing," Michael said, "but it's getting worse." The pastor nodded gravely. "Standing up for what's right often comes at a price. But you're not alone, Michael. The church is behind you." Jamar, listening from the kitchen, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there were more people on their side than he thought. At the diner later that week, an argument broke out between a customer and one of the waitresses. The customer, a burly man with a loud voice, was complaining about his order, growing increasingly aggressive. "You call this service?" the man shouted. "No wonder this place is going downhill. You're hiring trash." Jamar stepped forward, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "She's doing her job, sir. If you've got a problem, take it up with the manager." The man glared at Jamar, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "Who do you think you are?" Jamar straightened his shoulders. "Someone who's tired of people like you." Sal quickly intervened, de-escalating the situation, but Jamar's bravery left an impression. That night, as Jamar and Michael sat in the living room, Jamar recounted the incident at the diner. "I don't know what came over me," he admitted. "I just couldn't let him keep talking like that." Michael smiled. "That's because you're stronger than you think." Jamar glanced at the repaired window, then back at Michael. "Do you really think we can win against all of this?" Michael leaned forward. "It's not about winning or losing, Jamar. It's about doing what's right. And as long as we keep doing that, we've already won." Jamar nodded, a small spark of determination reigniting within him. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and the tension in Michael's apartment hung thick like a storm cloud. Jamar sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television while Michael washed dishes in the kitchen. "I used to have a family," Jamar said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Michael paused, drying his hands with a towel. "You want to talk about it?" Jamar nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "My mom. She was all I had. We didn't have much, but she tried. Then she got sick. Cancer. Took her real fast." Michael sat down across from him, his heart aching for the boy. "What happened after that?" "They put me in the system," Jamar continued. "Bounced from foster home to foster home. Some were okay. Most weren't." His voice tightened. "I ran away after the last one. I couldn't take it anymore." Michael leaned forward. "What happened in the last one?" Jamar hesitated, then whispered, "They weren't good people, and no one cared." Michael clenched his fists, anger rising at the injustice. "I care, Jamar, and you're safe here. I promise." The following Monday, Michael was called into his boss's office. His supervisor, a middle-aged man named Carl, closed the door and motioned for Michael to sit. "Michael," Carl began, leaning on his desk, "I need to talk to you about everything that's been going on." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Carl sighed. "The boy you've been housing. Word's gotten around. and some of the staff are uncomfortable. They think you're bringing too much attention to yourself and to us." Michael's jaw tightened. "What are you saying, Carl?" "I'm saying you need to tread carefully. We value you here, but this is a workplace, not a battleground. Keep your personal life separate, or there could be consequences." Michael stood abruptly. If standing up for what's right is a problem, maybe this isn't the right place for me. Carl's expression hardened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Michael." At the diner that evening, Jamar worked with renewed focus, trying to prove to himself, and to everyone else, that he was worth the trouble. He cleaned every dish meticulously, mopped the floor until it sparkled, and even stayed late to help Sal organize the pantry. "You don't have to do all this," Sal said, watching Jamar stack cans. "I know," Jamar replied, "but I want to." Sal nodded, his respect for the boy growing. "You've got grit, kid. Keep it up." The threats against Michael and Jamar escalated into a full-blown confrontation when someone spray-painted, "You're not welcome here," on the sidewalk in front of Michael's building. The graffiti was fresh, the paint still glistening when Michael and Jamar stepped outside. A small crowd had gathered, including some of Michael's neighbors. The air buzzed with tension as accusations flew back and forth. "This is getting out of hand," one woman shouted. "It's his fault for bringing that kid here," Jim retorted, pointing at Michael. Michael stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "You want to blame someone? Blame me. But leave the boy out of this." Jim sneered. "He's the problem, not you." "No," Michael said, his voice rising. "The problem is people like you who think it's okay to hate a kid for existing." The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others shaking their heads. Jamar stood frozen, torn between anger and fear. That night, Jamar couldn't hold it together anymore. He slammed his backpack onto the floor and shouted, "Why can't they just leave us alone?" Michael, startled, put a hand on his shoulder. "Jamar, it's okay." "No, it's not okay." Jamar snapped. "No matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, they're never gonna see me as anything but trouble." Michael knelt down, looking Jamar in the eye. "That's not true. People like Sal, the pastor, Mrs. Lopez, they see you for who you are." "Yeah? And what about everyone else?" Jamar demanded, his voice cracking. "They hate me. And now they hate you too. I should have never stayed." Michael gripped his shoulders firmly. "You stayed because you're worth it. And no amount of hate is going to change that." The next day at the diner, Sal found Jamar in the kitchen during a quiet moment. "Kid, I heard about the graffiti. You okay?" Jamar nodded silently. Sal crossed his arms. "Listen, people like that, they're cowards. They hide behind words and threats because they're too scared to face the truth. You keep doing your job, and let me handle the rest." Jamar blinked. "Why are you being so nice to me?" "Because someone was nice to me once," Sal said simply. "Now, get back to work." That evening, Pastor Jenkins visited Michael with a proposal. "I've been talking to some of the community," he said. "We want to organize a rally in support of you and Jamar." Michael hesitated. "I don't know, Pastor. Won't that just make things worse?" "Or it could show people that they're not alone in wanting change," the pastor replied. "You've inspired more people than you realize, Michael. Let us help." Michael looked at Jamar, who gave a small nod. "Okay," Michael said. "Let's do it." 2 nights before the rally, another attack rocked Michael and Jamar's world. Someone set fire to a trash can outside the building, and the flames licked dangerously close to the front door before the fire department arrived. As they watched the firefighters douse the flames, Jamar whispered, "This isn't going to stop, is it?" Michael's expression was grim. "Not unless we make it stop." The next morning, Jamar found a letter slipped under the door. It was handwritten, shaky but heartfelt. "I was wrong about you. You deserve a chance, just like anyone else. Keep going." Jamar showed it to Michael, his voice soft. "Do you think they mean it?" "I think people can change," Michael said. "And I think you're helping them see that." As they prepared for the rally, Jamar and Michael sat together, reflecting on how far they'd come. "You're not scared?" Jamar asked. Michael smiled. "Of course I'm scared. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you are. Jamar nodded, his determination solidifying. For the first time, he believed they might actually have a chance to change things. It was a crisp afternoon when the rally began. The small park near Michael's apartment was filled with folding chairs and a makeshift stage. Pastor Jenkins stood at the front, a megaphone in hand, greeting those who arrived. Supporters held signs that read, "Kindness over hate," and "Everyone deserves a chance." Michael and Jamar arrived together, their breaths visible in the cold air. Jamar hesitated at the edge of the park, his shoulders tense. "Do we really need to do this?" Jamar whispered. Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Just being here makes a difference." As they walked toward the stage, a group of counter-protesters stood across the street, holding signs with messages like, "Not in our neighborhood," and "Send him back." The tension was palpable. Pastor Jenkins stepped up to the microphone and addressed the crowd. His booming voice carried a sense of calm authority. "Today, we stand together to show that kindness and compassion are stronger than hate," he began. "This is about more than one boy or one man. It's about who we are as a community." The crowd cheered, though their enthusiasm was met with cheers from the counter-protesters. Jamar shifted nervously in his seat, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Michael approached the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and began. "When I saw Jamar on the street, I saw a kid who needed help. I didn't think about his skin color or what people might say. I just saw someone who deserved a chance. That's all any of us want, isn't it? A chance?" The crowd erupted into applause, but Michael's voice grew more resolute. "But that chance comes at a cost. Standing up for what's right always does. And if that cost is a few sleepless nights or a little pain on my car, so be it. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Jamar looked at Michael, his admiration growing. As Michael stepped down from the stage, Jamar tugged at his sleeve. "I want to talk," Jamar said, his voice barely audible. Michael blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" Jamar nodded, his jaw set. "Yeah, it's time." Jamar walked up to the microphone, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The crowd fell silent as he gripped the edge of the podium. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice shaky. "I'm just a kid. I don't have big words or fancy speeches, but I know what it feels like to be invisible, to feel like no one cares if you live or die." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Some faces were warm and encouraging, others cold and judgmental. "But Michael cared," Jamar continued, his voice gaining strength. "He gave me a chance when no one else would. And because of him, I'm not invisible anymore. I just want to prove that I deserve this chance, that I'm not the person some of you think I am." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jamar stepped back, his cheeks flushed. For the first time, he felt heard. As the rally continued, a group of counter-protesters grew more aggressive. One man, burly and red-faced, crossed the street and started shouting, "You're all fools. That boy's just another thug waiting to ruin this place," he bellowed, pointing at Jamar. Michael immediately stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough. You don't know him." "I know his kind," the man spat. "They don't change." Jamar surprised everyone by stepping between them. "You don't know me," he said, his voice steady, "but I'm going to prove you wrong." The man sneered but retreated, muttering under his breath. The crowd cheered for Jamar's bravery. In the midst of the rally, Mrs. Grayson, Michael's previously skeptical neighbor, stepped onto the stage. She looked out at the crowd, her expression hesitant but determined. "I haven't always been kind," she admitted. "When Michael brought Jamar into our neighborhood, I was one of the people who judged him. But I've seen how hard Jamar works and how much he's grown. He's proved me wrong, and I think he deserves our support." Jamar's eyes widened in surprise. He had never expected someone like Mrs. Grayson to stand up for him. As the rally continued, more neighbors began to speak out, sharing stories of how Michael and Jamar's determination had inspired them. The energy in the crowd shifted from tense to hopeful, the counter-protesters dwindling as the rally gained momentum. Sal stepped up to the microphone next. "This kid right here," he said, pointing to Jamar. "He's the hardest worker I've ever hired. If more people were like him, this world would be a better place." The crowd roared with applause, and Jamar couldn't help but smile. As the rally wound down, two young men from the counter-protester group lingered near the park, glaring at Jamar. Michael noticed them and walked over. "You have a problem?" Michael asked calmly. One of the men smirked. "Just wondering how long you're gonna keep playing, hero." "As long as it takes," Michael replied, his voice steady. "Now, if you don't mind, we've got work to do." The men exchanged a glance before walking away, their confidence shaken. That evening, back at the apartment, Michael and Jamar sat on the couch, exhausted but happy. Jamar held a plate of cookies Mrs. Lopez had dropped off after the rally. "You were amazing today," Michael said. "I'm proud of you." Jamar shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I just told the truth." Michael raised his mug of coffee in a mock toast. "Here's to the truth. And to change." Jamar clinked his soda can against the mug. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The morning after the rally, Michael stepped outside to find a surprise. Several of his neighbors were repainting the vandalized wall of his building. Mrs. Grayson directed the efforts, holding a bucket of white paint, while others scrubbed away the lingering graffiti. "You don't have to do this," Michael said, his voice touched with emotion. Mrs. Grayson gave him a warm smile. "Yes, we do. It's time we made things right." From a distance, Jamar watched, his heart swelling. For the first time, the neighborhood didn't feel like enemy territory. It felt like a community. Later that afternoon, an envelope was slipped under Michael's door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Jem, the neighbor who had been the most vocal critic. "Michael, I've been wrong. I see that now. Watching Jamar at the rally, I realized I've been judging him, and you, based on nothing but fear. I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Michael handed the letter to Jamar, who read it silently before looking up. "Do you think he means it?" Jamar asked. "I think he's trying," Michael replied. "And that's a good start." The next day, Jim showed up at the diner where Jamar worked. He sat at the counter and ordered a coffee. Jamar froze when he saw him, unsure of what to expect. "I'd like a slice of pie, too," Jim said, his voice softer than usual. As Jamar placed the order, Jim leaned forward. "You were brave yesterday. Took a lot of guts to speak like that. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Jamar nodded, his throat tight. "Thanks," he managed to say. When Jim left, he left a generous tip on the counter, a small but meaningful act of reconciliation. One evening, Sal pulled Jamar aside as they were closing up the diner. "I've been thinking," Sal said. "You've got a knack for this kitchen stuff. How would you like to help with prep work? Chopping veggies, seasoning meat, stuff like that." Jamar's eyes widened. "Really? You think I can handle it?" "Kid, I know you can," Sal replied with a grin. Jamar's hands trembled slightly as he tied on a fresh apron, stepping into his new role with a mixture of pride and nerves. With his first real paycheck from his new role, Jamar surprised Michael by bringing home groceries. Michael raised an eyebrow as Jamar set the bags on the counter. "What's all this?" Michael asked. "You've been feeding me this whole time," Jamar replied. "Figured it was my turn." Michael smiled and ruffled Jamar's hair. "You're a good man, Jamar." The atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. More people smiled at Jamar as he walked to work. Mrs. Lopez waved every morning from her garden, and a group of teenagers who had once jeered at him now nodded respectfully when they passed. One evening, as Michael and Jamar sat on the stoop, a little girl from down the street approached with a plate of cookies. "Mom said these are for you," she said shyly, handing them to Jamar. Jamar blinked in surprise. "Thank you." As she skipped away, Michael chuckled. "Looks like you've got a fan." A few weeks later, Sal gathered the staff at the diner for a quick announcement. "I just want to take a moment to recognize someone who's been working there but off," he said, glancing at Jamar. "This kid came in here with no experience and a lot of nerves, and now he's one of the best workers we've got." The staff clapped, and Jamar flushed with pride. Sal handed him a small envelope. A little bonus for all your hard work. Jamar opened it later and found a note. For believing in yourself as much as we do. At Pastor Jenkins' invitation, Michael and Jamar attended a Sunday service. The congregation welcomed them warmly, offering handshakes and smiles. During the service, Pastor Jenkins spoke about the power of forgiveness and the courage it takes to stand against hate. Afterward, the pastor approached Jamar. You've inspired a lot of people, young man, myself included. Jamar shuffled his feet, unsure how to respond. I'm just trying to do my best. And that's more than enough, the pastor said with a smile. One Friday evening, Michael convinced Jamar to come to the park after work. When they arrived, Jamar froze. A small crowd of neighbors and co-workers stood under string lights, clapping and cheering. What is this? Jamar asked, stunned. It's for you, Michael said. A little celebration for everything you've accomplished. There was food, music, and laughter. Sal gave a short speech, and Mrs. Grayson even brought a cake. Jamar felt a lump in his throat as he realized how much things had changed. That night, Jamar and Michael sat on the couch, reflecting on the evening. I never thought I'd have something like this, Jamar admitted. A job, friends, people who care. Michael smiled, his voice warm. You earned it, Jamar. Every bit of it. Jamar looked down at his hands, the calluses from weeks of work a testament to his journey. I couldn't have done it without you. Michael shook his head. You had it in you all along. I just gave you the chance to see it. The diner was bustling with its usual lunchtime rush, but something was different. Jamar wasn't just washing dishes anymore. He was behind the prep counter, slicing vegetables with precision. Sal stood nearby, nodding approvingly as Jamar efficiently prepared ingredients. Hey, Jamar, Sal called over the noise of the kitchen. You've got a knack for this. Keep it up, and you'll be cooking soon. Jamar looked up, his face lighting up with a rare, genuine smile. Thanks, Sal. When a coworker passed by and gave him a fist bump, Jamar realized he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. At Michael's workplace, things were shifting as well. Carl, his supervisor, approached him after a team meeting. Michael, Carl began, his tone more respectful than it had been in months. I've been hearing about what you've been doing for that boy. It's impressive. Shows real character. Michael raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to trust the sudden change in attitude. Thanks, Carl. I'm just doing what anyone should. Carl smiled faintly. Maybe, but not everyone does. Keep it up. The interaction left Michael feeling vindicated, as if the tides were finally turning. One afternoon, as Jamar walked home from the diner, a group of younger kids playing basketball in the park waved him over. Hey, you want to play? One of them asked. Jamar hesitated, and used to such open invitations. But when they tossed him the ball, he couldn't resist. Soon, he was laughing and running with the group, the weight of his past momentarily forgotten. As they walked home together afterward, one boy said, You're cool. We should hang out more. Jamar grinned. Yeah, I'd like that. Michael was called into a meeting with the company's regional director, who had heard about his efforts to help Jamar. Michael, the director said, Your actions have inspired a lot of people, both here and in your community. We need more leaders like you. That's why we're offering you a promotion. Michael was stunned. A promotion? The director smiled. You've earned it. Michael accepted, feeling a surge of pride, not just for himself, but for what it meant for Jamar's story. One evening, Sal gathered the staff before closing time. Everyone, I've got an announcement, he said. Starting next week, Jamar will officially be training as a line cook. The room erupted in cheers. Jamar stood frozen, unsure how to react. Me? He asked, pointing to himself. Sal grinned. Yeah, you. You've earned it. Jamar's chest swelled with pride as his co-workers clapped him on the back. For the first time, he felt like his future was something he could shape. Michael took Jamar to a local GED program one Saturday morning. The classroom was small but welcoming, filled with other teens and adults looking for a fresh start. Why are we here? Jamar asked as they stepped inside. Because you're ready, Michael replied. You've got the skills and the drive. Now it's time to get the education to match. Jamar hesitated, but eventually nodded. All right, I'll give it a shot. The instructor greeted them warmly, and as Jamar sat down to fill out his registration, he felt a strange mix of fear and hope. One Friday night, Jamar surprised Michael by cooking dinner, a simple but delicious spaghetti dish. As they sat at the small dining table, Jamar raised his glass of soda. "To you," he said, "for everything you've done for me." Michael chuckled and raised his coffee mug. "To you, for proving everyone wrong." They clinked their glasses, a quiet but meaningful moment of gratitude passing between them. Pastor Jenkins organized a town hall meeting to discuss ways to improve the community. Michael and Jamar were invited as special guests. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he said, helping Jamar wasn't about charity. It was about seeing someone's potential and refusing to give up on them. Imagine what this neighborhood could be if we all did the same. The room filled with applause, and Jamar felt a surge of pride. People were finally listening. Jamar began to walk through the neighborhood with his head held high. People who once avoided him now waved or stopped to chat. Mrs. Grayson even invited him over to help with her garden, a gesture that shocked both Michael and Jamar. "I've been wrong about a lot of things," Mrs. Grayson admitted as they planted tulips. "But you've taught me it's never too late to change." Jamar smiled, wiping dirt from his hands. "Thanks, Mrs. Grayson. That means a lot." As Michael and Jamar sat on the stoop one evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, Jamar turned to Michael. "I've been thinking," Jamar said, "maybe one day I can help someone the way you helped me." Michael smiled, his voice filled with pride. "You already are." Jamar nodded, the weight of his past finally lifting. He had a job, an education plan, and a community that believed in him. For the first time, his future felt bright. The day had finally arrived. Jamar stood at the front of a small auditorium, holding a crisp certificate with the words GED completion embossed in gold. The room was filled with his peers, their families, and supportive community members. Michael sat in the front row, clapping the loudest as Jamar's name was called. Jamar walked across the stage, his heart pounding. For a moment, he hesitated, overwhelmed by the applause. But when he saw Michael's proud smile, he straightened his shoulders and accepted the certificate. As he stepped off the stage, Jamar whispered to himself, "I did it." After the ceremony, Michael handed him a small wrapped box. Inside was a leather-bound notebook. "For your dreams," Michael said. "Write them all down." Back at the diner, Sal pulled Jamar aside. "So, kid, now that you've got that fancy certificate, how would you feel about taking on more responsibility here?" Jamar blinked, unsure how to respond. "You mean like cooking more?" Sal shook his head with a grin. "I mean like running the kitchen one day. We'll start with assistant manager duties, train you up." Jamar's jaw dropped. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Sal replied. "You've earned this, Jamar." Jamar nodded, his throat tight. "I won't let you down." One evening, Michael and Jamar sat on the couch, going over Jamar's savings and plans for the future. Jamar hesitated, tapping his pencil on the notebook Michael had given him. "What's on your mind?" Michael asked. "I was thinking," Jamar began, "about maybe opening my own place someday. A diner like Sal's, but you know mine." Michael beamed. "I can't wait to eat there." Jamar laughed. "Might take a while." "That's okay," Michael said. "Dreams worth chasing always do." Pastor Jenkins invited Michael and Jamar to visit the new community center, a project inspired by the rally. Inside, there were classrooms for tutoring, a small kitchen for teaching cooking skills, and a recreational area for kids. "We're naming the kitchen after someone who's inspired all of us," the pastor announced, unveiling a plaque that read, "Jamar's Corner." For the boy who showed us hope, Jamar stared at the plaque, speechless. When the pastor asked if he'd be interested in teaching cooking classes there, Jamar nodded, still overwhelmed. "I'd love that," he said softly. At a local community awards ceremony, Michael was honored for his role in mentoring Jamar and bringing the neighborhood together. As Michael accepted the award, he said, "This isn't just about me or Jamar. It's about what we can do when we believe in each other." When we choose love over fear. The crowd erupted in applause. Jamar, watching from the audience, felt a surge of pride for the man who had changed his life. One day, as Jamar walked home, he noticed a boy sitting on the curb with a cardboard sign, "Hungry. Anything helps." Jamar hesitated, memories of his own time on the streets flooding back. Taking a deep breath, he approached the boy and crouched down. "Hey," he said gently, "you okay?" The boy shook his head. "I just need a little help." Jamar smiled. "I've been there. Come on, let's get you something to eat." As they walked toward the diner, Jamar felt a sense of purpose he'd never known before. Mrs. Grayson stopped by Michael's apartment with a pie. "I just wanted to thank you both," she said, handing the pie to Jamar. "This neighborhood feels different now. Better. And it's because of you." Jamar smiled shyly. "I didn't do much." "You've done more than you realize," she replied. After she left, Michael teased, "Look at you, the neighborhood hero." Jamar rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide his grin. One morning, a letter arrived for Jamar. It was from his former caseworker, who had heard about his progress. "Jamar, I always believed you had potential, but I never imagined you'd go this far. You're an inspiration, not just to other kids in the system, but to all of us who work with them. Keep going. The world needs more people like you." Jamar read the letter twice, then handed it to Michael. "I guess I'm doing okay, huh?" Michael grinned. "Better than okay." Jamar stood in front of a group of kids at the community center, his hands shaking slightly as he explained how to chop vegetables safely. The kids listened attentively, their faces eager. When one of them asked, "How'd you learn all this?" Jamar paused, smiling. "Someone gave me a chance. Now I'm giving it to you." After the class, a little boy tugged on Jamar's sleeve. "I want to be a chef too, like you." Jamar knelt down. "You can be. Just keep showing up." One evening, Jamar and Michael sat on the stoop, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. The tension that had once defined their lives was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging. "You've come a long way," Michael said, sipping his coffee. "So have you," Jamar replied, leaning back. "What do you think's next for us?" Michael smiled. "Whatever we want. The future's wide open." Jamar nodded, his gaze steady. "I think it's gonna be good." Jamar and Michael both firmly rooted in their new lives. Their journey an example of how love, resilience, and belief in one another can transform not just individuals, but entire communities.